Welcome to Nolan Reads. My name is Nolan, and I'm the narrator and editor of the original audiobook you're about to listen to. If you want to get right to listening to A Modest Proposal, please go right ahead. Skip ahead to the start of essay timestamp below and get right to listening. If you've been assigned this essay at school, I might suggest you read along with the text as I do, as some of the sentences are kind of complicated and following along I find really helps. If you like the narration, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. I hope you enjoy. For those of you who aren't jumping right to listening and are interested in the history of this piece, over the next few minutes I'm going to give a little introduction to this essay, its author, and his time period in a way that I hope will help you get the most out of listening to it. So let's get started. I first personally encountered this essay in high school, like I'm sure many of you did as well, but I can't for the life of me remember when it was assigned. All I know is that whenever it was assigned, we were certainly learning about satire, as this is without a doubt the premier text example of satire that teachers use when they're introducing the concept. I'm not going to talk too much about satire in general, as I'm sure you're either here because you're doing that in school already, or you're long out like me and are already quite familiar with the style and its use. I chose to read this essay because I really wanted to see how relevant it still was to us today. Of course, the language is now archaic and kind of formal, and if it were published today, the details would likely be written very differently. But I was curious. Does the basic brunt of the essay still hit a target? And is that target still a worthy one to hit? I'm not going to share my opinion here because I like for listeners to engage with the work for themselves before I share my thoughts. But if you want to hear what I have to say, stick around till the end of the video and I'll offer what I think there. But to the man himself, and quite an interesting man he is. The author of A Modest Proposal is Jonathan Swift. Mr. Swift was born in 1667 in Dublin, Ireland. If he was alive today, he would be 359 years old and probably very confused. Swift was a writer of tremendous wit and humor, although he probably would not have identified himself as a writer. It just happened to be something he did alongside everything else he was involved in. He may have eventually considered himself a statesman of Ireland, fighting for fair treatment from England, but it's not like he ever comes out and puts this on a name tag and declares it about himself. And he was also a cleric of the Anglican Church, although his actual religious beliefs when it comes to dogma are sort of hard to pin down. You may already be getting a sense that saying much about Swift definitively can be kind of challenging. He likely would have been happy to hear that. Swift seems to have really relished his privacy, or required it. Most of his works are written under pseudonyms. His closest relationships were discovered in letters to women that he gave his own private nicknames to, and they're sometimes written in encoded language. We don't even know if his possible closest companion in life was a secret wife, a secret relative, or perhaps just a very good friend. And the people around him weren't sure either. His other most famous work, Gulliver's Travels, also a satire but written as a fantasy adventure, was published entirely anonymously. He left half the manuscript of the story with a publisher he had never worked with before in the dead of night, with a note saying that if they left cash for him, he would deliver the rest of the story. Remarkably, they were into this arrangement, and the book was put into print. It's been suggested that the political nature of his work could have been what led him to behave in this way. Or perhaps it was a habitual secrecy brought about by the way he was brought up or the circumstances of his close personal relationships. Probably it's some kind of a blend of all those things. Jonathan Swift's life is in some ways political before he's even born. His grandfather was a royalist whose estate was destroyed during the English Civil War, leaving Jonathan Swift's father, conveniently also named Jonathan Swift, to relocate himself from England to Ireland to set up life as a lawyer. He would die from syphilis before his namesake son was born. Young Jonathan Swift Jr. was raised by a wet nurse who took him away to England until he was 3 years old. Why this happened is totally unclear. He wouldn't even meet his mother until he was in his early 20s, but more on that later. He was admitted to Trinity College Dublin at the age of 15, where he exclusively studied Greek, Latin, logic, and debate, and he seems to have hated it. Although he was incredibly intelligent, he was not any kind of remarkable standout in school. Later, as he was working towards his master's degree, political unrest caused him to leave Ireland for England, a back and forth that you will hear he will continue for the rest of his life. His mother, at this point, whom he probably just met, helped him land an incredible job as an assistant to a Sir William Temple, who was leaving public service to work on a collection of memoirs at an estate in the country. We don't know exactly how this happened. Perhaps his mother had secret connections to the Temple family, perhaps she knew a friend of a friend, but it has also been suggested that Jonathan Swift may have been Sir William Temple's illegitimate son. In any case, it's kind of funny to think about Swift, who would become one of the most well-known writers of the English language, sort of standing around taking notes on the memoirs of someone who history would take significantly less interest in. It makes me laugh that this was like his first job. Eventually, Sir Temple would send this roughly 24-year-old Jonathan Swift to King William III to argue in favor of a bill Sir Temple supported. I have no doubt that this sort of proximity to power at such a young age for someone of fairly common origin would have had a tremendous influence on his thinking and the scope of his political ambition. Swift then began living in Moor Park, and it was at this time that he met and tutored Esther Johnson, age 8, whom he nicknamed Stella. Over the course of the rest of their lives, the two would develop a long-lasting and very close, but impossible to define relationship. Were they secretly married? Were they related? Were they related and secretly married? Nobody knows. Shortly after first meeting Stella, Swift briefly leaves England for Ireland due to illness that most people now believe to be Meniere's disease, which continued bothering him for the rest of his life. After getting well again, he returns to England and receives his master's from Oxford and becomes an ordained Anglican priest. His role as a priest placed him in a small remote community which was not to his liking at all, being far from the political scene. After the death of Sir Temple, he takes it upon himself to finish Temple's memoirs, hoping it will lead him to a position closer to the seats of power. But it does not. The finished publication attracts some small amount of scandal, and he returns to Ireland to serve as a rural parish priest and in an administrative role in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. It was at this time, after around 1700, that he really began writing in earnest. He also received his doctorate in divinity from Trinity College, Dublin, where he would eventually serve as dean. He spends time visiting London, publishes A Tale of a Tub and The Battle of the Books, and grows in reputation and political influence. The politics of this time period is complicated, and he was deeply involved, but to explain it all is sort of outside the scope of this introduction. So let's just say that Swift gets heavily involved first with the Whig Party and then with the Tories. He was described as Whig in terms of politics and Tory in terms of religion. But to return to the subject of romance, around 1707, Jonathan Swift would meet Esther van Homrigh, who would become the great romantic partner of his life. Kind of. It's complicated. He called her Vanessa, and he arrived at this name by taking the Van from her last name and adding Essa, which was a common nickname at the time for Esther. So, Jonathan Swift seems to have invented the name Vanessa, a high point on a long list of other accomplishments. Vanessa was deeply, deeply in love with him, and he seems to sometimes be in love with her too. But they never marry. Maybe this was because he was already secretly married to Stella. Maybe he viewed Vanessa's incredible passion as being too much to handle and worried about legitimizing the relationship through marriage. We don't know. Sadly, she died at the age of 35, having just removed Mr. Swift from her will. Around this time, Swift is in pursuit of a position in the Church of England that would allow him to stay there permanently. But things do not go his way. Queen Anne, who is sitting on the throne, takes a particular dislike to Mr. Swift because she deems some of his writings to be blasphemous and others to be too forward and personal, so she does not grant him any position that is within her power to grant. His friends find something for him outside of her control, but before long, the Whig Party wrests back power from the Tories, and Jonathan Swift once again returns to Ireland as a sort of refuge. It's at this time that he composes perhaps his most famous works, the one you're about to listen to, A Modest Proposal, and Several Remote Nations of the World in 4 parts by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon and then a captain of several ships, better known as Gulliver's Travels. One of the most interesting things I discovered about Swift while researching him was this quote I want to share on human rationality. It comes from a letter to his friend Alexander Pope. It's a little complicated, and we'll break it down together, and hopefully you'll give me a break on my Latin pronunciation, which is bad. Quote, I have got materials toward a treatise proving the falsity of that definition animal rationale, and to show it should be only rationis capax. What he means is that he disagrees with the common assertion that man is a rational animal, and instead asserts that man is an animal capable of being rational. But that does not imply it is his natural way of being. We are capable of thought and reason, but engaging in thought and reason are not our most natural mode. I think he might have said that our most natural mode would be of intense emotionality, irrationality, and sometimes competition. He certainly lampoons these aspects of humanity in a wonderful poem of his called Verses of the Death of Dr. Swift, a poem about how he thinks people will respond to his death. If you're interested in Swift, I highly recommend it, as it's delightfully self-deprecating and offers a real glimpse into his humor outside of a kind of formal essay. But to get back to that formal essay, I want to share a final thought on A Modest Proposal before we dive into it. People often understand this essay as a critique of conditions of poverty in Ireland, or a general criticism of how those in power can look at the poor and destitute as inconveniences instead of people. It certainly is both of these things. But there is another dimension to the essay that a couple of different people have, wrote about over time that I think is well worth exploring. Swift's famous proposal that the children of the poor be used as food, thus solving the problem of hunger in Ireland, may also be a critique of the lazy thinking that leads to one-stop, cure-all solutions that are pitched to desperate people by those seeking power or acclaim. Solutions that can be reduced to slogans and taglines whose details will never appear or be explained. How soothing to believe that incredibly complicated problems can be solved by one convenient idea. But this in practice is rarely possible, and I think A Modest Proposal is making fun of this flawed way of thinking as much as everything else. I'd love to hear what you think below. I hope you enjoyed the recording. At the end, I'll come back and say hello and share some of my own thoughts about the essay and what it was like to record it. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, and consider donating or joining the Patreon, where my patrons can watch this and all my other videos ad-free. Without further ado, Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from Being a Burthen to Their Parents or Country, and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public.
A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. It is a melancholy object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country when they see the streets, roads, and cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, or 6 children, all in rags, and importuning every passenger for an alms. These mothers, instead of being able to work for their honest livelihood, are forced to employ all their time in strolling to beg sustenance for their helpless infants. who as they grow up either turn thieves for want of work, or leave their dear native country to fight for the Pretender in Spain, or sell themselves to the Barbados. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in the arms or on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance, and therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound, useful members of the Commonwealth, would deserve so well of the public as to have his statue set up for a preserver of the nation. But my intention is very far from being confined to provide only for the children of professed beggars. It is of a much greater extent, and shall take in the whole number of infants at a certain age who are born of parents in effect as little able to support them as those who demand our charity in the streets. As to my own part, having turned my thoughts for many years upon this important subject, and maturely weighed the several schemes of other projectors, I have always found them grossly mistaken in the computation. It is true, a child just dropped from its dam may be supported by her milk for a solar year, with little other nourishment at most not above the value of 2 shillings, which the mother may certainly get, or the value in scraps by her lawful occupation of begging, and it is exactly at 1 year old that I propose to provide for them in such a manner as instead of being a charge upon their parents or the parish, or wanting food and raiment for the rest of their lives, they shall, on the contrary, contribute to the feeding, and partly to the clothing, of many thousands. There is likewise another great advantage in my scheme, that it will prevent those voluntary abortions, and that horrid practice of women murdering their bastard children, alas, too frequent among us, sacrificing the poor innocent babes I doubt more to avoid the expense than the shame, which would move tears and pity in the most savage and inhuman breast. The number of souls in this kingdom being usually reckoned 1.5 million, of these I calculate there may be about 200,000 couple whose wives are breeders, from which number I subtract 30,000 couples who are able to maintain their own children, although I apprehend there cannot be so many under the present distress of the kingdom. But this being granted, there will remain 170,000 breeders. I again subtract 50,000 for those women who miscarry, or whose children die by accident or disease within the year. There only remains 120,000 children of poor parents annually born. The question, therefore, is, how this number shall be reared and provided for, which, as I have already said, under the present situation of affairs, is utterly impossible by all the methods hitherto proposed. For we can neither employ them in handicraft or agriculture. We neither build houses, I mean in the country, nor cultivate land. They can very seldom pick up a livelihood by stealing till they arrive at 6 years old, except where they are of towardly parts, although I confess they learn the rudiments much earlier, during which time they can however be properly looked upon only as probationers, as I have been informed by a principal gentleman in the county of Cavan, who protested to me that he never knew above 1 or 2 instances under the age of 6, even in a part of the kingdom so renowned for the quickest proficiency in that art. I am assured by our merchants that a boy or girl before 12 years old is no saleable commodity, and even when they come to this age they will not yield above 3 pounds, or 3 pounds and a half a crown at most on the exchange, which cannot turn to account either to the parents or kingdom, the charge of nutriment and rags having been at least 4 times that value. I shall now, therefore, humbly propose my own thoughts, which I hope will not be liable to the least objection. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. I do therefore humbly offer it to public consideration that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be reserved for breed, whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine. And my reason is, that these children are seldom the fruits of marriage, a circumstance not much regarded by our savages. Therefore 1 male will be sufficient to serve 4 females, that the remaining 100,000 may, at a year old, be offered in the sale to the persons of quality and fortune throughout the kingdom, always advising the mother to let them suck plentifully in the last month, so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little pepper or salt will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. I have reckoned upon a medium that a child just born will weigh 12 pounds, and in a solar year, if tolerably nursed, increaseth to 28 pounds. I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords, who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. Infant's flesh will be in season throughout the year, but more plentiful in March, and a little before and after, so we are told by a grave author, an eminent French physician, that fish being a prolific diet, there are more children born in Roman Catholic countries about 9 months after Lent than any other season. Therefore, reckoning a year after Lent, the markets will be more glutted than usual, because the number of popish infants is at least 3 to 1 in this kingdom, and therefore it will have one other collateral advantage, by lessening the number of papists among us. I have already computed the charge of nursing a beggar's child, in which list I reckon all cottagers, laborers, and 4/5 of the farmers, to be about 2 shillings per annum, rags included, and I believe no gentleman would repine to give 10 shillings for the carcass of a good fat child, which, as I have said, will make 4 dishes of excellent nutritive meat when he hath only some particular friend or his own family to dine with him. Thus the squire will learn to be a good landlord, and grow popular among his tenants. The mother will have 8 shillings net profit, and be fit for work till she produces another child. Those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flay the carcass, the skin of which, artificially dressed, will make admirable gloves for ladies, and summer boots for fine gentlemen. As to our city of Dublin, shambles may be appointed for this purpose in the most convenient parts of it, and butchers we may be assured will not be wanting, although I rather recommend buying the children alive, and dressing them hot from the knife, as we do roasting pigs. A very worthy person, a true lover of his country, and whose virtues I highly esteem, was lately pleased in discoursing on this matter to offer a refinement upon my scheme. He said that many gentlemen of this kingdom, having of late destroyed their deer, he conceived that the want of venison might be well supplied by the bodies of young lads and maidens, not exceeding 14 years of age, nor under 12, so great a number of both sexes in every country being now ready to starve for want of work and service, and these to be disposed of by their parents if alive, or otherwise by their nearest relations. But with due deference to so excellent a friend and so deserving a patriot, I cannot be altogether in his sentiments. For as to the males, my American acquaintance assured me from frequent experience that their flesh was generally tough and lean, like that of our schoolboys by continual exercise, and their taste disagreeable, and to fatten them would not answer the charge. Then, as to the females, it would, I think, with humble submission, be a loss to the public, because they soon would become breeders themselves. And besides, it is not improbable that some scrupulous people might be apt to censure such a practice, although indeed very unjustly, as a little bordering upon cruelty, which I confess hath always been with me the strongest objection against any project, however so well intended. But in order to justify my friend, he confessed that this expedient was put into his head by the famous Salmanazar, a native of the island Formosa, who came from thence to London about 20 years ago, and in conversation told my friend that in his country, when any young person happened to be put to death, the executioner sold the carcass to persons of quality as a prime dainty, and that in his time the body of a plump girl of 15 who was crucified for an attempt to poison the emperor was sold to his imperial majesty's prime minister of state and other great mandarins of the court, in joints from the gibbet at 400 crowns. Neither indeed can I deny that if the same use were made of several plump young girls in this town who without one single groat to their fortunes cannot stir abroad without a chair and appear at playhouse and assemblies and foreign fineries which they never will pay for, the kingdom would not be the worse. Some persons of a desponding spirit are in a great concern about that vast number of poor people who are aged, diseased, or maimed. And I have been desired to employ my thoughts what course may be taken to ease the nation of so grievous an encumbrance. But I am not in the least pain upon that matter, because it is very well known that they are every day dying and rotting by cold and famine and filth and vermin as fast as can be reasonably expected. And as to the young laborers, they are now in as hopeful a condition. They cannot get work, and consequently pine away for want of nourishment, to a degree that if at any time they are accidentally hired to common labor, they have not strength to perform it, and thus the country and themselves are happily delivered from the evils to come. I have too long digressed, and therefore shall return to my subject. I think the advantages by the proposal which I have made are obvious and many, as well as of the highest importance. For first, as I have already observed, it would greatly lessen the number of papists, with whom we are yearly overrun, being the principal breeders of the nation as well as our most dangerous enemies, and who stay at home on purpose with a design to deliver the kingdom to the pretender, hoping to take their advantage by the absence of so many good Protestants, who have chosen rather to leave their country than stay at home and pay tithes against their conscience to an episcopal curate. Secondly, the poorer tenants will have something valuable of their own, which by law may be made liable to distress and help to pay their landlord's rent, their corn and cattle being already seized, and money a thing unknown. Thirdly, whereas the maintenance of 100,000 children from 2 years old and upward cannot be computed at less than 10 shillings apiece per annum, the nation's stock will be thereby increased 50,000 pounds per annum, besides the profit of a new dish introduced to the tables of all gentlemen of fortune in the kingdom who have any refinement in taste, and the money will circulate among ourselves, the goods being entirely of our own growth and manufacture. Fourthly, the constant breeders, beside the gain of 8 shillings sterling per annum by the sale of their children, will be rid of the charge of maintaining them after the first year. Fifthly, this food would likewise bring great custom to taverns, where the vintners will certainly be so prudent as to procure the best receipts for dressing it to perfection, and consequently have their houses frequented by all the fine gentlemen, who justly value themselves upon their knowledge in good eating, and a skillful cook, who understands how to oblige his guests, will contrive to make it as expensive as they please. Sixthly, this would be a great inducement to marriage, which all wise nations have either encouraged by rewards or enforced by laws and penalties. It would increase the care and tenderness of mothers toward their children, when they were sure of a settlement for life to the poor babes, provided in some sort by the public, to their annual profit instead of expense. We should see an honest emulation among the married women, which of them could bring the fattest child to the market. Men would become as fond of their wives during the time of their pregnancy as they are now of their mares in foal, their cows in calf, their sows when they are ready to farrow, nor offer to beat or kick them, as is too frequent a practice, for fear of a miscarriage. Many other advantages might be enumerated. For instance, the addition of some 1,000 carcasses in our exportation of barreled beef, the propagation of swine's flesh, and improvement in the art of making good bacon, so much wasted among us by the great destruction of pigs, too frequent at our tables, which are no way comparable in taste or magnificence to a well-grown fat young child, which roasted whole will make a considerable figure at a Lord Mayor's feast or any other public entertainment. But this and many others I omit, being studious of brevity. Supposing that 1,000 families in the city would be constant customers for infants' flesh, besides others who might have it at merry meetings, particularly at weddings and christenings, I compute that Dublin would take off annually about 20,000 carcasses, and the rest of the kingdom, where probably they will be sold somewhat cheaper, the remaining 80,000. I can think of no one objection that will possibly be raised against this proposal, unless it should be urged that the number of people will be thereby much lessened in the kingdom. This I freely own, and 'twas indeed one principal design in offering it to the world. I desire the reader will observe that I calculate my remedy for this one individual kingdom of Ireland, and for no other that ever was, is, or I think ever can be upon earth. Therefore let no man talk to me of other expedients, of taxing our absentees at 5 shillings a pound, or using neither clothes nor household furniture except what is of our own growth and manufacture, of utterly rejecting the materials and instruments that promote foreign luxury, of curing the expensiveness of pride, vanity, idleness, and gaming in our women, of introducing a vain parsimony, prudence, and temperance, of learning to love our country, wherein we differ even from Laplanders and the inhabitants of Topinamboo, of quitting our animosities and factions, nor act any longer like the Jews, who were murdering one another at the very moment their city was taken, of being a little cautious not to sell our country and conscience for nothing, of teaching our landlords to have at least one degree of mercy toward their tenants, lastly, of putting a spirit of honesty, industry, and skill into our shopkeepers, who, if a resolution could now be taken to buy only our native goods, would immediately unite to cheat and exact upon us in the price, the measure, and the goodness, nor could ever yet be brought to make one fair proposal of just dealing, though often and earnestly invited to it. Therefore, I repeat, let no man talk to me of these and like expedients, till he hath at least some glimpse of hope that there will ever be some hearty and sincere attempt to put them into practice. But as to myself, having been wearied out for many years with offering vain, idle, visionary thoughts, and at length despairing of success, I fortunately fell upon this proposal, which as it is wholly new, so it hath something solid and real, of no expense and little trouble, full in our own power, and whereby we can incur no danger in disobliging England. For this kind of commodity will not bear exportation, the flesh being of too tender a consistence to admit a long continuance in salt, although perhaps I could name a country which would be glad to eat up our whole nation without it. After all, I am not so violently bent against my own opinion as to reject any offer proposed by wise men, which shall be found equally innocent, cheap, easy, and effectual. But before something of that kind shall be advanced in contradiction to my scheme, and offering a better, I desire the author or authors will be pleased maturely to consider 2 points. First, as things now stand, how they will be able to find food and raiment for 100,000 useless mouths and backs. And secondly, there being a round million of creatures in human figure throughout this kingdom whose whole subsistence put into a common stock would leave them in debt to millions of pounds sterling, adding those who are beggars by profession to the bulk of farmers, cottagers, and laborers with their wives and children who are beggars in effect. I desire these politicians, who dislike my overture, and may perhaps be so bold as to attempt an answer, that they will first ask the parents of these mortals whether they would not at this day think it a great happiness to have been sold for food at a year old in the manner I prescribe, and thereby have avoided such a perpetual sense of misfortunes as they have since gone through by the oppression of landlords, the impossibility of paying rent without money or trade, the want of common sustenance with neither house nor clothes to cover them from the inclemencies of the weather, and most inevitable prospect of entailing the like, and thereby have avoided such a perpetual sense of misfortunes as they have since gone through by the oppression of landlords, the impossibility of paying rent without money or trade, the want of common sustenance with neither house nor clothes to cover them from the inclemencies of the weather, and the most inevitable prospect of entailing the like or greater miseries upon their breed forever. I profess, in the sincerity of my heart, that I have not the least personal interest in endeavoring to promote this necessary work, having no other motive than the public good of my country, by advancing our trade, providing for infants, relieving the poor, and giving some pleasure to the rich. I have no children by which I can propose to get a single penny, the youngest being 9 years old, and my wife past childbearing.
So, that is A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. I promised in the introduction that I would share here whether or not I still think this essay's argument is relevant and useful, and I'm a man of my word, and I'm not going to keep you waiting. So, yes, I do. I do think it's relevant. Perhaps, on the whole, the life of the average impoverished person in a first world country has improved, but income inequality is possibly worse than ever. Grocery stores in many countries are allowed to legally destroy food that doesn't sell instead of giving it away. And as a critique of that lazy one-stop shop solution seeking that I mentioned in the introduction, I think a modest proposal may be more relevant than ever, as people's attention spans for multi-step solutions has deteriorated. So, yeah, I think a modest proposal really holds up. As far as the recording of the essay goes, for those who are curious, this is a new format for me, doing these face-to-camera beginnings and endings, and I'm re-editing my older audiobooks and bringing them into this format, and updating the audio quality as best I can as I go. But if you've listened to some of my more recent works, you might notice that they sound slightly different, and if you noticed that, you're correct. This was one of the first pieces of audio I ever recorded, and it was done with a different microphone in a much different studio and with a lot less knowledge, but I hope you still enjoyed it and got something out of it. Listening back to it, I hear that I kind of take on a sort of matter-of-fact, bureaucratic energy as a kind of character delivering this essay. I think it works, but I don't think it's the only way to deliver this piece. I think you probably could find a lot of other ways to deliver it and have the humor come through and the meaning come through. I specifically remember when I was recording, struggling with some of the longer sentences. Anything from this time period has this difficulty. I recorded George Washington's farewell address, which is so interesting to me, but also a huge challenge when it comes to very long sentences with kind of nested Russian doll parenthetical thoughts. There's a specific challenge that comes with recording longer thoughts with parenthetical ideas. That happens when you're reading out loud because there's always this question of like, where you're going to breathe. But I think we've gotten to a place where longer sentences, even when you're reading in your head, are just harder to parse because we aren't used to entertaining sustained thoughts and arguments. I think reading or listening to works like this and other older pieces of literature are an incredible way of resetting your brain and training it to have a stronger capacity to focus. I think that's part of why I've always loved older literature, why I've always sought it out and enjoyed it. I feel like I come away from it with a sort of heightened feeling. And when I'm reading a lot of older texts, I feel like I'm a better listener, and I'm also better able to articulate my own thoughts and feelings. It's like the difficult language rubs off on me in a really useful, helpful way. I don't know if everyone feels that way when they read these kinds of works, but certainly for me, I do. Now, this is a bit of a sidebar, but as I was studying Jonathan Swift while I was writing the introduction, I kept coming across this phrase, biting humor. I'm sure you've heard this phrase. His biting humor in this, the biting humor of, and it's a kind of like off-the-rack expression, and it's really kind of well-worn. There's another off-the-rack expression, and kind of teetering on losing meaning, at least for me. It made me think of something I've been noticing more and more lately, and something I think certainly would not have made Jonathan Swift happy as a genius, the genius that he was. But as we all spend more time online and engage with more people and more content than ever before, I've noticed a growing homogeneity in the way we speak and write, especially in the way people comment online and make jokes to each other in person. I mean, how many times have you heard that phrase after someone has like shared their thoughts and feelings and they go, "Thanks for coming to my TED Talk," or after a comment someone agrees with online that they post right beneath it just the word "this." It drives me crazy, and it's so repetitive. When I was a professor, more than one time I heard a student kind of like roll off this turn of phrase that in the moment I found really funny and was kind of charmed by it. And then time would go by and I would hear it over and over again out of the mouths of them and every single one of their friends and also people they didn't know in other classes. And I kind of realized, like, damn, like that moment wasn't organic to them. And I won't be the first to say it, but I think that when you're expressing something that's important to you, especially if you're an artist, you have to find language that's your own. And if you're being funny, if you want to make people laugh, so much of comedy is born out of surprise, and repetitive quoting is just not very surprising. I think this matters deeply right now in our politics as well, where common phrases are used as unconscious passkeys, letting people know that we're a member of this in-group or that in-group. The repetitiousness supports factionalism, and when not used with the in-group, it can shut down what might be an otherwise fruitful conversation between people of opposing viewpoints. I think we're all guilty of this. But as AI starts looming over us all and people use it to write all of their words for them, I'm going to start in my own life trying to be even more intentional about the things I say and the way I joke and making sure it's coming from some part of me or my unconscious and isn't just direct repetition. I am in such admiration of the way Jonathan Swift writes. I think he's incredibly courageous, and his originality as a thinker is jaw-dropping. A Modest Proposal is still gruesome and shocking today, and I can't even imagine the kind of response it probably got in his time. And Gulliver's Travels is a story that is delightfully bizarre and about as inventive as you can get. I love the way that everything that he writes is so full of attitude and mockery, and yet is still so linguistically engaging and, at least to our ears now, formal. I think there's something inherently funny about telling someone F you in such a high rhetorical style, and no one ever did it better than Jonathan Swift. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of the video. If you like this, whatever this is, please let me know in the comments below, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider donating to the Patreon. Thanks so much for listening.